There we go. Okay. Hello and welcome to the April installment of Safe Space for White Questions. My name is Ajay Parasram. I am, who am I? I am very tired today because I dropped my father-in-law off at the airport at 4 a.m. And I am coming to you today unusually from the West Coast, Coast Salish territories, instead of Mi'kma'ki, the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Squamish, Musqueams, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I've been for the last couple of weeks. If this is your first time coming to Safe Space for White Questions, you are most welcome. Thank you for coming. And I'll pass it to my co-host, Alex, in just a minute. If it is your first time, basically what we do here is we take your questions live and anonymous, and we just go back and forth trying to provide good, clear answers. No questions that are posed with good intentions will be ignored. So feel free to send them in, and you'll get the gist of it pretty quick. So pass it over to my pal, Alex. Oh, I forgot to say, I am a professor at Dalhousie University in Mi'kma'ki on the East Coast. I'm just discombobulated because I'm all the way over on the West Coast. Alex?
Thanks, Ajay. Hey, I'm Alex Khasnabish. I am the co-host of Safe Space for White Questions, and so glad to be here with you this month. I am coming to you from our regular location from the East Coast, from Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki, unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. And so happy to be here with you. I do my gig at Saint Vincent University, where I'm a professor in sociology and anthropology. And yeah, we're excited to kick things off with you for another month's worth of questions. If this is indeed your first time with us, then yeah, we go back and forth, and it's Ajay's turn to lead things off this month. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
Cool. Before we get started, I just also wanted to say, in case, because we know we have some folks who like to check out the show from abroad, we are coming to London, England, the heart of the imperial metropole. Next month, Alex and I will both be there. We're going to be doing some fun book promotion and like discussions and workshops and stuff at what they're calling a festival of decolonization. So if you happen to be in the heart of empire in mid-June, come check us out. All right, so our very first question comes from someone who was trying to get in on last month's session, but we just missed it because it came through YouTube. So apologies for missing your questions. We're going to get to them first before we kick off with the other ones. So this is a question about policing. I'm going to paraphrase because it's quite lengthy. And the question seems to be that, so talking about policing, the last few months has seen several police deaths in Toronto, Montreal, and Edmonton. It's amazing to see the huge funerals and honors these officers get, not that they don't deserve it. The question is just that they seem so self-unaware, so they're not aware of what's happening as a group. Like all the deaths and abuses by police directly that we hear about, how is it police and other people don't honor the victims? So the question is about how we honor the police, but we don't honor the victims of police violence. The question continues. Seems kind of obvious that they wouldn't want to highlight their crimes and mistakes, but it just seems so glaring that the whole stadium honoring police officers and such historical disregard for all the other issues. So I think the essence of that question is, structural violence is happening all over society. It's being, in many ways, exacerbated, at least, to put it politely, by the state forces, the police. And society as a whole tends to honor the police, but not honor the victims of police violence. I think there's a couple of different explanations for this. The way I would approach a question like this is to start by saying, nationalism is such that the focus of nationalism and national self-repair is always to repair damage to the nation. And the police in this country represent the sort of quote unquote protectors of the nation. So if you're protectors, if you're knights, if you're, if you're the people who are meant to be the defenders of the law and decency and et cetera, of society, if they go down, you honor them as heroes, and you try to ignore the kind of mistakes or structural violence that those people were implicated in. And in that sense, there's nothing particularly unique about this. What is, I think, unique is that in the sort of modern age of the last 200-300 years and the rise of policing and police societies, you see increasingly this moment in which police are more and more necessary to keep a peace, a very tenuous peace, as the gap between people who are rich and people who are incredibly poor gets wider and wider at a time in society when it's supposed to be getting narrower and narrower. So to preserve the sort of integrity of the Canadian imagination or the American imagination, or, like the Filipino whatever kind of nation state you're talking about, you create heroes out of dead people, ideally, because a dead person can't do something that is going to make them, seem bad after they're dead, generally speaking. So it's low-hanging fruit for national self-repair. So you want to highlight and create big ceremonies so that everybody in the country can feel good about being Canadian, which is really problematic because it whitewashes the complexity of Canada, right? Like there's a lot of really wonderful things about living in a place like Canada, and there's a lot of really awful things, particularly, based on the color of your skin, the gender that you appear as, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's really what's happening here. It's a simple case of not wanting to confront the kind of ugly truth that policing is inherently violent, that it's inherently statist, that it's inherently about the subjugation of masses for allegedly the benefit of society. And to tell the stories of those who suffer the consequences of police violence in a national public way would be to tell the nation, listen, we have some shit to work on. And like, just so that I'm being absolutely clear, that's what we should be doing. And I agree with the sort of premise of this question, but I think it's unrealistic for us to expect the state to actually do that work. That's work that, activists all over this country and every country do every day by trying to put the spotlight on state violence and police violence. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons on both sides of that question, super timely, given, killings carried out by police, but also killings of police officers in recent months. So it's very much on people's minds and in the news. I mean, I think AJ's done a great job of really highlighting what is for me the biggest issue around policing, which is this, just like the military, it's like this conflation of the national project with dominant institutions, right? And we could talk about a lot of institutions like that. We talk about, the media, we could talk about schools, we could talk about the role of authorized religions in promoting a sense of nationalism or community solidarity. Some of that stuff is important. Obviously, every society wants to cultivate a sense of solidarity, but some of it, as Ajay has been banging on the head here, is all about basically papering over those growing, gaping chasms between those who have and those who do not, right? So think of any state spectacle, it's like when this, after the Portapique massacre in Nova Scotia, when the Snowbirds, right, the Canadian Air Force's special aerial acrobatics team flew over Nova Scotia, it didn't mean anything in terms of the horrific massacre that had been carried out by the killer. Didn't bring any of the victims back, nor did it do anything really for the memory of the RCMP officer who was slain in the line of duty. But, it reminds us of Canadian nationalism, of the project, of the state. We all kind of center that rather than thinking, as the rest of the time hopefully has been taken up by, but certainly now, about like what brought that massacre into being. Why didn't the police warn the public, a million other things around that issue that had been talked about with respect to that inquest too. So I think that's super important. I mean, the other thing I'd say, and I say this reluctantly because it's not really part of the way I think about it, but I will acknowledge this. I think in the question, and I think you in asking the question, you rightly center this, but I'll say this anyway. I think like to take the best sort of take on this. Let's remember that think what's going on here, at least in part, is that people are saying, well, unlike ordinary people like me, for example, when I go to my job, police officers, firefighters, paramedics, etc., are actually, they are engaged in a profession where they encounter danger in all kinds of forms on a fairly regular basis. So those funerals, and when an officer loses their life, are supposed to be about people who are, rightly or wrongly, I suppose, intentionally taking a risk, supposedly for the benefit of society, right? So, I think there is something about it. Like for me, I think when we think about those moments, there's no activism, I think, let me put it this way, that I think can happen around police funerals that's effective. Like you're just going to end up like alienating a whole bunch of people. But your point is well taken, that there's a discrepancy here, that what's really going on, as Ajay has said, is kind of like a nationalist spectacle that's supposed to kind of bring us back together and reaffirm our commitment to the ruling class and its status quo. So, yeah, I mean, at the basis, that's what's going on. But obviously, there are other issues, and that's not, this shouldn't need to be said, but obviously, this is nothing to do with suggesting that anybody, deserves a violent death, or that the violent deaths of police officers are not things to mourn. They have loved ones, they have families, all that stuff, of course. I'm not going to engage in facile kind of denunciatory politics around this. But yeah, the point is well taken. Who gets commemorated and who doesn't? Back to you, AJ.
All right. Thanks for that, Alex. And thanks for that question. The next question, I'm just going to paraphrase it a bit because it's another kind of lengthy one. So the question reads, is the fear of being replaced that white people experience, so the white fear of being replaced, especially amongst white men, globally, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, the question is this grounded in reality? Marginalized people are deeply aware of not having a voice in society or in places of power and in places of decision making. So is there some empathy towards the concern that eventually a white person will be completely disregarded just because in the past their race messed up so much? Okay, so where to start with this one? Again, taking it in the best possible way. What this question is basically asking is there some truth to the fact that some white people really fear that, they will be erased, they will become marginalized by society, and basically it sounds like a role reversion to some extent. I don't think that there's any grounds to that at all. And I think that the person asking the question, you can take comfort in the knowledge that there's no fear of this. Nobody's trying to replace people. What is happening, and this is the things that we've talked about periodically throughout the show, so you can go back and check out some of the past episodes, but like things like what do they call it, like equity hiring and that sort of thing, the strategic ways in which people are trying to correct the overrepresentation of whiteness, particularly white maleness, in decision making. I think that might be part of what's generating the fear, especially amongst white men, that their roles may become marginal. But the objective has never been to marginalize a perspective or a person. The objective has been to try to equalize the playing field to some extent. We've said a couple of times that basically the last couple 100 years has basically been a affirmative action program for mediocrity amongst white men. And we don't say that to be mean, We say it because, generally speaking, whiteness and maleness in the last 200 years has allowed people to move easily into the corridors of power, as you mentioned. So I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for all racialized people, obviously, but I don't think that there's a great deal of empathy. Like, people may feel empathy for the fact that, maybe in some particular instances, it might be slightly more difficult for somebody who is not who is overrepresented in a field, might have a harder time finding the cushy job that they 20, 30 years ago would have simply been able to walk into. But that is not in any shape or form, I think, an erasure. And the last thing I'll say before I pass it over to Alex for comments is that, remember, it's really important to always keep in mind that there are no races amongst humanity, right? Whiteness is a shifting idea. It has definitely always been about exclusion and privileging an extreme minority of human society. There's no biological basis to race outside of the human race, and therefore white people are never and have never been at any actual threat or fear of erasure, in large part because in reality there is no white, there is no black. These are all sociological, historical, discursive things. And this is somewhat related to a question that is going to come up later, so I think we'll have a chance to come back to it. But just to paraphrase what I think about this, nobody's interested in punishing white people for the deeds of their ancestors. What everybody is interested in, I think, is ensuring that the world that we all share together is a world premised on equity and premised on fairness, which is a world that a lot of the white elites of the last several hundred years tried to convince everybody we were already living in. Mm-hmm. Right? Tried to convince, like, if you work hard enough, and this is where it folds into capitalism and to patriarchy and et cetera, that's basically been horseshit, right? Like, the last couple hundred years has not been the liberal utopia that even liberals believe that we've been living in. Mm-hmm. To some extent, what the objective of kind of racial justice organizing has been dedicated to has been to try to actually create the world that lots of white people think that they were already living in, but actually it does not exist. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, when we create the conditions that actually underscore the fear of white erasure, we'll actually be in a political and social position to no longer have to worry, I think, about that kind of politics anymore at all. So we'll all get there together. And ultimately, because the work of anti-racism is grounded in collective liberation, it's not about punishment in any shape or form. So, Alex?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful answer. I guess I would just, I'm going to maybe add in a couple of points here. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, like, as we talked about many times in this series, as we talk about in our book, when people kind of as a group express anxiety about their group fading away or being replaced or displaced, I think, there's a really valuable moment to ask, okay, so what are you really anxious about, right? Like, what's going, and, I think for most white identified people, they wouldn't say, oh, I'm like scared that, like people who aren't white are going to come and like literally move me out of my house or, take my stuff. No, they're worried about like the stuff Ajay was just talking about. They're worried about economic opportunity for their kids. They're worried about whether their elders will have decent health care to the end of life. They're worried about, this climate, pandemic, society, political crisis that we're in the midst of, right? Trying to find a way they're worried about all of that stuff. And, we don't, like anybody, like if you struggle with anxiety personally, you probably know that the things you're anxious about are not actually things that are like real problems in your life necessarily. They're like triggers and targets your anxiety is looking for to express itself and justify itself. Now, I'm not trying to like individualize all this, but if you take a moment to think about that, then I think, in the same way, our anxiety is about the future, about the community we live in right now, about the society, about, the hopes for our future generations, everything else. They're all wrapped up in that, right? And they often find expression in idioms or in vernaculars that aren't about the thing that they're expressed in. So the whole fear of replacement, I think, is very much wrapped up in this, right? This idea that there isn't enough jobs, there aren't enough resources, there isn't enough, like decent, clean air and water, like all this stuff, right? That we're all going to be, and this is the motivating factor at its best case. Like the darker thing I have to say here is that I think this is all very much an intentional ideological project. And, this is one thing I'd really caution people to be wary of. The Great Replacement theory is a far right, neo-fascist, white supremacist talking point. And it actually came out of, there's a French novel that was kind of the impetus for this, whose name I'm totally blanking on right now, but essentially, from the 70s kind of kicked off this fear of the unwashed dark masses, like rolling like a disgusting fetid wave over civilized Europe and North America, and destroying civilization. And of course that's nonsense. I mean, if we're to look at this moment historically, if there was a fear of replacement, let's for those of us located in North America, certainly we need to talk about the actual replacements that happened here, which was, of course, settler colonialism, right? And the massive depopulation of the Americas after the invasion by Europeans. But even subsequent to that, this concerted attempt to erase Indigenous life, erase Indigenous societies. I mean, that's a replacement. That's a horrific genocidal replacement, right? So, nobody's trying to accomplish that right now. I think it's fair to say, right? But aside from that, it's a way of whipping up anxieties that are kind of existential. And when people fear that their very existence is threatened, they will do incredible, nutty, and dangerous things, right? As we've seen over the last decade or so. So this whole Great Replacement theory is like, it's just red meat for the far right. It's well regarded as kind of a critical recruitment and talking point by far right activists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Demographically speaking, of course, we see demographic change in societies. Humans move, right? So this is the thing I would, kind of demand, that if you're one of these white people who experiences this as a threat, then you need to reconcile yourself with this reality. How do you justify speaking in such shrill tones about your own supposed replacement when you steadfastly deny any attempt to come to a just resolution with the first inhabitants of these territories who were actually replaced? You can't have both things at once. You can't say, if I'm walking down the street punching people in the face, and then somebody turns around and punches me back, and I'm like, whoa, 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 I can't have both things, right? I can't live in a world shaped by the actual replacement of societies, civilizations that were here, and the physical destruction of people, and then handing over the idea that, I don't know, a statue in downtown Halifax is being removed because the dude it was honoring was, basically a failure and a genocidal maniac and a settler colonial, right? You just it's just I don't mean to insult children. I'm a parent. I love kids, but it's kind of childish, right? You can't have it. And in so many ways, this kind of whether we're talking about Make Canada or America Great Again or whatever, these campaigns that have kind of centered around this idea of replacement. I mean, especially in Canada, the demographics are a little bit more advanced than the States. They have a larger non-white population, but in Canada, holy cow, we're awfully far from anything but a white majority here. And even with the significantly increased levels of immigration that are needed to keep the economy going, we still will have a majority white country. So, humans have always moved. We've always traveled. And if that's your justification for why your ancestors are here on, what was originally someone else's territory, then I think it's kind of hypocritical to argue that nobody else's ancestors or nobody else gets to come here and change that too. It's just human movement, people, human movement. Back to you, AJ.
Right on. Okay, thanks. The next question says, Latinx is the new term used, especially in the United States. This is referring to people who come from so-called Latin America. So Latinx is the new term used, especially in the United States. I'm all for the reason to move away from gendered terms of Latino and Latina, but why add a letter? Wouldn't it make more sense to just say Latin? I mean, okay, I'm not a linguist and I don't even speak Spanish. So I'm definitely not an expert on the grammar aspect of this. So I'm going to focus on the political and historical, perhaps, aspects of the question to basically say at like one level, I just think whatever it is that people want to be described as and is generally speaking should be the go-to. So if people by and large are saying, this is the thing that works for me, my inclination as a non-grammatician, et cetera, is like, cool, I'll roll with that. We've talked about this in different contexts, even last month when we talked about the term BIPOC. It's a term that I heard my students using. It seemed to resonate with them. It was okay. It's not necessarily the term I would choose to use. But I think the bigger question, historically anyway, for me is, if we're thinking about different terms, like it's the last part of this question that catches my interest, the term Latin. Like to some extent, why are we privileging Latin languages, Latin culture at all? And it's kind of a dicey subject sometimes. Like when the subject of like whiteness and white fragility emerges in a Latinx context, saying this as a totally not Latino guy, obviously, right? But what I've observed is that the manifestations of what I would see as kind of white fragility takes on different tones altogether in that region. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. The first is that the sort of post-colonial moment across most of Latin America happened a good 100 years before it happened in the English-speaking world. And I think for a lot of Anglophones who kind of only understand the British Empire and stuff, we forget that there was loads of other empires as well, the Spanish being just one of them. And when the post-colonial moment, when the colonies sort of officially and technically became post-colonies, it was still dominated by white elites who saw themselves as the victims, right? In that context. And perhaps in some kind of weird economic, social way, we can say that they were, but there were obviously tiers of marginalization, particularly with respects to indigenous and African descended people across much of Latin America. So my inclination would be to privilege the languages of the land. So if there are, like Maya, Aztec, etc., words that could be resuscitated and used, we should probably be privileging specificity as we try to do across Turtle Island here, right? When we talk about, Mi'kmaq people and Mi'kmaq language evolving alongside Mi'kmaqi, or like Salish languages out where I'm at right now. I think that level of specificity ultimately is much better than any kind of like, broad terminology. And anybody who's read, even the famous book by Benedict Anderson on imagined communities, like it actually kind of goes through and explores this sort of imagination aspect of that post-colonial moment in Latin America and the importance of language to that. So yeah, maybe I'm kind of sidestepping the essence of the question. If the essence of the question is really why the X, then I don't know. I don't know why the X. I don't particularly care one way or the other. But if it's about like, why are we privileging Latin languages in places that have indigenous languages, my inclination is go for specificity and see what's out there in indigenous languages that might very likely have a whole different view than just gender binary. You know what I mean? Alex?
Yeah, great answer. I'm going to take this as, admittedly, my Spanish is terrible now, but I used to be like a passable speaker when I was doing my field work like 20 years ago in Mexico. And so just as like what I assume is some of the background of this question, and maybe some of our viewers would be familiar with this too. In the States, this has recently been a big deal because there was some conservative Latino lawmakers who in their individual states were looking to ban the term Latinx because they felt it was a form of, well, they were alleging that it was a form of cultural appropriation, like one of their arguments around that was that linguistic formation, you would never use it in any Latin language. So, and you wouldn't use it in Spanish, right? Like the X doesn't, like it's an English convention, not a Spanish one. And, you know, to be fair, like I think as an anthropologist who has a very poor understanding of linguistics, I get that to some extent. Like as an Anglophile, right? I'm like, well, who am I to impose my linguistic rules, even the ones that I like, right? That might speak to like a non-gendered or a non-gender binary way of identifying people. Like that's for those people to work out. I'm not really interested in policing their languages, particularly because I speak other languages so poorly. On the other hand, I think it's worth making a point. Like we can't call it Latin. It's not Latin. What you mean is Spanish. We can't turn Latino and Latina into Latin. That's anglicizing it. Like that is not a construction, and so you can't do that. So that's just not on the table. The argument from people who are against the use of the X is that Spanish already has a convention for what they call gender neutral terms, right? So there's a gender neutral, there's a masculine and a feminine, and all nouns have one of those, right? Unlike English. So you'd be like, well, cool, they already have one, which is their argument. But the problem is that the gender neutral term is the same as the male term. So Latino, like if you were to, you know, like that dog over there, right? You don't know if it's a male or female dog, so you're just going to call it a dog. You default to the male form of that noun, right? Perro. So like you can argue that that's gender neutral in the same way that I've had people argue with me that saying like chairman or manhole cover or fireman is neutral, because for the longest time it was like the assumed term that you use as a catch-all. But it's not, it's fucking not, right? Like what it is like a patriarchal imposition. And many of those languages obviously have that convention. I'm not laying all the blame there, but that's the problem, right? So you have gender justice activists who are saying, like, fuck your patriarchal convention. We need a new term, and it can't be one of the existing ones because it just returns us to the same problem. Like it returns us to a male female binary world in which there are only those two positions and there's no acknowledgement of another subject position. But again, I'm not going to tell Spanish speakers that is not my business. Okay. Like people who are embedded in those communities, as Ajay was saying, it's for them to figure out. I would totally welcome. And of course there are initiatives on this around, you know, the recovery resurgence of Indigenous languages in the global South that tends to be, in many cases, much further along than we are up here. Many of those communities have much more like vibrant linguistic cultures, many more of them. There are tons of Indigenous nations all across Mexico, just as an example. And many of those languages are still very much actively spoken. And in fact, if you go into rural areas in Mexico, you'll find many people who don't speak Spanish who still speak their Indigenous languages. So they're not using those terms anyway. Again, like it's like the Great Replacement thing. I'd say don't get caught up in a fake controversy around like an English incursion into Spanish, and don't try to solve the problem, because and I think I'm pointing this out gently, like Latin is not a term. Like Latin cultures, even as Ajay was pointing out, like if you're going to remember that, actually, again, what you need to remember is that settler colonialism like happened under very different terms in the global South, okay? And in part it happened because they simply didn't have enough settlers. They didn't have enough conquistadors. So the mixing, what we euphemistically call mixing with a local population, produced a new one, a new which is called mestizo in Mexico and elsewhere in the global south. It means mixed. And it should be a way around all of this, right? It should be, because in sort of ideologically, it's a celebration of both the Spanish or Portuguese, like especially the Spanish in the case, Spanish culture with the indigenous cultures that it's all been blended with, right? If you go to Mexico City, go to the big Zocalo in the center of Mexico City, it's called the Plaza of the Three Cultures, right? You've got Aztec, you've got conquistador, and then you've got like modern Mexico on top of it. It's cool. It's like a recognition. But of course, in the same way that Canadian museums are happy to display totem poles, but also aren't exactly part of the cutting edge against settler colonialism, racism against Indigenous peoples is still incredibly pronounced in the global south and in Mexico particularly. So again, don't mistake the spectacle for the reality. Don't get caught up in I'm sure many of you don't remember, but I remember being confused when they started being floated as an I was like, but they is like more than one person. How am I supposed to know? And I said that in good faith, not because I didn't support trans issues, but because I was only coming to an understanding of them. So it's cool and fine to come to an understanding of these things. But I hope with some of this background, you understand that the issue certainly isn't about just imposing kind of a cultural imperialism from the Anglo North, solving your problem by, hey, just use an English term. Second, the problem really isn't that there's already a term for this, because the existing term reimposes the patriarchal system. So yeah, language changes. It's fair for speakers to fight about that and to work out things that make sense for them. But it's not okay to say, this is the way it's been. These are the rules. They have systematically excluded other people in their experiences, but because it's tradition, we're going to keep doing it. So yeah, I just leave it at that. Back to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. That was much more comprehensive than I was able to offer. I learned a lot from that one. So thanks for that. The next question, moving right along, is about land acknowledgements. And it's a very simple question, in a sense. It says, what is your take on land acknowledgements? So short question, big question. So I take on land acknowledgements. There's so much to say here. 15 years ago, I don't think I ever heard a land acknowledgement. I started hearing them about 10 years ago. In my experience, mostly in the kind of West Coast, and then it kind of felt like it kind of moved east a little bit. I'm sure it was probably happening much longer than that, but that was when I first started hearing them. Started using them around that time too. My take on it is, I feel like in some sense, I don't know, they're okay, what I'll say is, wherever possible, always privilege Indigenous leadership over Indigenous issues. There may be lots of different perspectives to navigate amongst Indigenous people about this. And I think that at the heart of the matter is, a land acknowledgement should be a personal thing that a speaker, a presenter, a teacher, a facilitator, whatever, engages with to some extent, and meaningfully engages with in the work that they're doing. Because, so, I'll use as an example, I have, in my course syllabi, the land acknowledgements that I use is built around the fact that I link to digital copies of the Treaties of Peace and Friendship that's stored in the Nova Scotia Provincial Archive. I'm a history teacher as well as international development studies teacher. There's a pedagogical imperative, I think, for students taking my classes to understand that these are real documents. I encourage the students in the land acknowledgement to go to the physical archive if they can, to engage with and work with these treaties and think about what this means for you as a treaty person, because that's the leadership that I'm following from Mi'kmaq people who, in my experience, often will point to the treaty. Not to say that the treaty is the be all end all, but just that if you want to think about what your relationships and obligations are as an immigrant in Mi'kmaq, then the treaty offers a starting point as opposed to an end point. So in that sense, there's there's a reason for it. You can't always get into that level of detail, but the worst thing you can do, in my opinion, is to simply just rattle something off that's then completely disconnected from what it is that you're doing. So we, like you will have heard that we always acknowledge the land, but we believe and hope that the substance of what we're doing here engages with and works in solidarity with the cause of the liberation of Indigenous peoples and land. That's our interest. I think Hayden King is particularly insightful about this. Hayden King, I think, was instrumental in normalizing the idea of land acknowledgements 10, 15 years ago. And I heard him on the news maybe 3 years ago, where he was saying, I forget who he was talking to now, but somebody on CBC. But he was saying, if I had to go back and do it all over again, I'm not sure I would have tried to push for the land acknowledgements. And the reason why is that people are using it in this kind of tokenistic ways to check a box without any serious engagement about what it means to do to engage with land. When I see land acknowledgements done well, oftentimes they're actually done by Indigenous people who are not on their Indigenous territory. Who, I'll give you the example of, I was just recently at the International Studies Association, where Indigenous colleagues were present, and like more than actually doing a land acknowledgement, some of them who are coming from like Hawaii and elsewhere, we were in Montreal, and they did their land acknowledgements, but they came to the conference early. They met with Mohawk people. They went and visited Mohawk territories and built relationships, invited some of them back into the conference, and had dialogue and meaningful exchange. Like, to me, it's like that is a way to arrive. You know what I mean? And it's really involved, and it takes a lot of time, and it means that maybe you miss like all kinds of other panels and all the stuff that you conventionally do. But in that sense, a land acknowledgement is deliberately and purposefully disrupting the inertia of the kind of settler logic of what you're supposed to do professionally. And in that sense, it's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. If a land acknowledgement does not disorient to reorient in a way that centers the substance and history of the land, I think that to some extent it's just doing lip service, and maybe in the worst case scenario, it's some kind of virtue signaling that like look, I know where I am, even though I don't know what the land means, or And to that extent, there's there's a pretty hilarious YouTube clip you can look up from Baroness von Sketch about land acknowledgements that really kind of articulates the problematic of land acknowledgements better than I ever could. So yeah, I think land acknowledgements are important because they've done the work of forcing people to think about it. Because when we first started doing them, everybody was like, even other scholars and stuff were like, what the hell are you doing? Like, what does this mean? Like, we only have 12 minutes on this panel. So if you spend 4 minutes on a land acknowledgement, how are you going to possibly deliver what it is you have to do? It forces conversation, and it forces attention to certain things like the substance and history of land and people, which I think is essential. But if you're not going to do that, then it's better not to do a land acknowledgement, because you are not truly acknowledging the land, right? It's like it's a real thing. If you acknowledge land, you have to think about land. You have to spend time with land. You have to change the things that you think based on what you learn from land. It's a real commitment. So if you're not willing to make that real commitment, don't pay lip service to it. Alex?
Yeah, that was a great answer. I don't have anything to add. I'm just going to say ditto.
Cool. All right. So the next question we have here, there is one incredibly long question, and apologies to that person. I just while we're live, I can't possibly paraphrase it. So I will try if I get the time before we leave, but otherwise I'll look at it and then we can address it next week. So some of the shorter ones. All right. Basically, it seems that all places of employment are being called out for having racist or white supremacist agendas and policies. What does that mean? And are you saying people who work for them are racist? So if you're Black and work for them, then you're racist too, right? Okay, so this question, I would say, especially because of that last line, pushes the boundary of what we would see as an acceptable question for the show. I'm going to take it in part because I read it. I obviously didn't look at it first. The tone of the question on the last part, so if you're Black, it means you're racist too, right, is not the tone that we generally like to land on in the show. But the substance of the question, I think, does explore something that's central to our show and central to our book, which is what is the relationship between structure and agent? So if an institution that you work for, whether university, the post office, whatever, if it has historically been built on racist premises, so like the privileging of white male cis bodies for employment and advancement, et cetera, does that mean that every individual who works there is a racist? It has almost nothing to do with any individual. Like individuals in the broader scheme of these things don't matter much at all. Individuals are important because they're the agents who participate and plug into bureaucracies, broadly speaking, and recreate it through deciding not to fight about things, you know? So if they just like, well, this is the policy that we've always had, so, you know, nothing personal. It's just that we only take Christian holidays off and that's our tradition. So, you know, to call that a Christian supremacist organization, I think is fairly accurate. Literally, you are putting, you know, Christian holidays on top of and valuing them as something to celebrate and mark over and above every other holiday that exists because of some idea about, you know, culture and tradition. So that is, in that case, an accurate empirical description of what's happening across many, you know, Canadian institutions because of convention, because the school system is built around that, right? Like, or whatever justification we can have for it. Is every individual racist? So I think like maybe policing, like we talked about earlier, is a good way to think about this. If the police serve a historically racist role in society and are fulfilling white supremacist mandate through the overrepresentation of incarcerated Indigenous and Black people in particular, people of color more generally, does that mean every individual cop is a racist? Well, it means that every individual cop is part of replicating and protecting the integrity of a racist structure. Everybody who exists in society, that in a society that is built on white supremacy, sustained by white supremacy, is inadvertently, perhaps, contributing to it until such a time that they are actively not. And this, you know, Ibram X. Kendi spells this out really clearly in his work, which is How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? This is one of those few moments where binary juxtaposition, I think, is actually pretty useful. You can either be against structural racism and work actively against it, or else you're just part of the inertia that's allowing it to go unchecked. So yeah, it's not about being an individual racist because the individuals at some level are not that relevant. It's about racist institutions premised and protected on that have been privileging certain groups of people, white people, cis bodies, male bodies, etc. That have to do that. And then, yeah, you know, so to the substance of the last clause of your question, if you are Black or if you are Indian or if you are whatever, and you're working for one of those institutions and you're not challenging those things within that institution, then yeah, you are participating in a structurally racist institution. And that's kind of hard to hear, right? Because it's like, well, how could I be actively working against my own interests? But once you start to understand how people, because of their material conditions or desires or mental situation or whatever the reason is, how people actually actively participate in their own oppression, then you're just starting to understand how society works. Because if you think colonialism, you know, in India or something happened because of the strength of like, you know, white British people turning up, you know, with like 10,000 people and being like, well, okay, we run the show now. That's not how it worked. The process of bringing people into kind of colonial institutions like the civil service, like the military, et cetera, this is the way that that power in society protects itself. Because people power, this is why people say power to the people, right? When you have power to the people, as opposed to the elites, then you can actually affect kind of real substantive change. But when people are embedded in problematic institutions, then yeah, they're helping to recreate that institution. And it sucks to hear that, but I think that it's accurate. So yeah, Alex?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways that I think we could go with this question. I think Ajay's done a great job of speaking to its most important elements. Well, I guess like to start off, I would say, I think part part of the issue that I have with your question is that it's so like, it's one of these, I have a friend who has a friend who has a sister who has a friend who has an in-law who has a friend who once had an abortion at 42 months. Yep, 42 months, the kid was born, and actually, if like, these things are the talking points you hear from the wingnuts anti-choice side of things, right? So you're going to give us a question here that says basically every single place of employment, oh, isn't this so frustrating? Isn't this so shitty having to deal with these uppity people who are like fed up of being treated as subhuman and calling out systems, relations, and institutions for being so? Well, I'm sorry that your world is being disrupted by people fighting for their humanity, but there it is, like if that bothers you, I encourage you to find like a remote cave to crawl into or a bridge to live under. You could be the troll for the whole community, man. Like, I don't know, like, what else am I supposed to say to a question like that? First of all, I don't go around calling individual people racist. I don't think that that's like, unless you are a dedicated, dyed-in-the-wool, like member of a white supremacist or otherwise like ethnic nationalist or like whatever movement, then you're not an avowed racist, right? Like people who are members of the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, like Hindu nationalists who are like, lighting Muslims on fire. These people are racists, right? We can talk about these people as racists. But if you are an individual in society who's kind of steeped in these ideas about other people's humanity that have been like, you've been socialized into, I'm not saying you're guiltless, but you're probably not like an ideological active racist looking to whip up public violence in a mass-based way against those people in your community. At least I hope not. So yeah, like if you're working in a coffee shop and there's like a racist policy, let's say we won't serve people with, head coverings, or you are told by your owner to follow around every single like Black teenager who comes into the coffee shop to make, but every other teenager gets a free pass, then yes, of course, like you're not racist, but you are obviously enacting policies that are degrading and targeting people based on this totally spurious category that has been used historically and still today to deny people their humanity, to open them up for new forms of domination and exploitation that enrich those who have and dispossess those who don't. If you're uncomfortable with that reality, I don't know, like I suspect you're not living at the very top of the 1%. Why don't you ask yourself what kinds of policies and your workplace you find degrading and objectionable? If you can't point to a single one, then you're probably a white dude. And that's not because white guys are somehow immune from this. But like we keep saying through all these years of doing this show, it's not about your essential being. It's about the fact that this era of civilization on this planet has been indelibly shaped by white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism that was driven largely by the engine of European expansionism. It's not because Europeans are uniquely to blame. Lots of other people are imperialists and colonialists, okay? But our moment is shaped by that because those are the people that came here. Those are the people who built the ships and 500 years ago, sailed over here, engaged in this whole process. Capitalism arose. Like that's the historical forces pushing that forward, okay? So take a breath. Let yourself acknowledge that you are not personally to blame for white supremacy, and then get to work making this world more decent, more humane, more free. Like the less violence, the less oppression, the less exploitation there is, the freer we all are. And I don't frankly know what the hell people's problem is with that idea, why they would rather double down on a world that is nothing but violence of all against all, then they would see a world that you would come to an understanding with people. And yeah, of course, you don't gotta like everybody. All kinds of people are assholes. You could be an asshole. I don't know. Like maybe, maybe that's the problem. But it's not about us as individuals. It's about like, how can I build a society where I am protected And everybody else is protected structurally from these gross abuses of power and privilege and authority that ruin people's lives, that have like exterminated populations. You know, you can have a problem with somebody individually. You can even be like, you know, like have an issue with any kind of specific intervention, but don't make this a kind of metaphysical issue about racism and people's entitlements, and then use it as a way to deny people their humanity. Back to you, Ajay.
Thanks for that, Alex. I think we got time for two quickish questions before we call it a day. So the first one is there an essential Black culture? And that's the whole question. So, you know, first, I think, as should not be a surprise to folks who've been watching the show for a while now, no, there is no essential Black culture, just like there's no essential white culture, there's no essential like brown culture, et cetera, et cetera. That said, there have been attempts to kind of rally around and resuscitate an aspect of Blackness historically for the purpose of like collective liberation, and it's contested and controversial. I'm talking about Black power here in this context, and when you think about like Pan-Africanism, so there have been attempts by African people, predominantly African people, to lay a claim for what global Blackness or transnational Blackness means in the world. And there's been really significant theoretical and scholarly and activist work towards this that I really think everybody should probably read. I've been engaging with it a lot more recently, particularly the work of Walter Rodney. And I would encourage everybody to read Walter Rodney, read everything that he's written. This was like, for those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he was like a Marxist historian from the Caribbean, from Guyana, and he was considered to be like just a dangerous intellectual of his time because of his ideas. He wrote his most famous book is called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, but his other books are really wonderful too, in particular The Groundings with My Brothers, because it was actually when he came home and the substance of his work was such that, like, he said things like, the Black Academy is not really Black because they're in bed with capitalism and white supremacy, but like workers over here like are. So he had an expansive and interesting understanding of political Blackness. And there's contemporary literature on this too by Robbie Shilliam. His book, The Black Pacific, talks about how indigenous youth hip hop artists in the Pacifica region inhabit this sense of radical political Blackness. Walter Rodney again has written about how indentured laborers in the Caribbean, people like my ancestry, could be considered Black under the rubric of his Black power, because of the similarity, because of the relationship between racialization and class and history. So there are really deep and divergent ideas. Some people, some people in Africa are really opposed to the idea of Pan-Africanism. It arises in the diaspora. It's kind of a diaspora thing. It's not uniformly accepted. I understand where people are coming from there too, because they're like, well, I would identify as my particular tribe, or whatever. Like, what is this thing? I've heard from many African colleagues and friends in particular that they didn't think about themselves as Black until arriving in the diasporic condition, because until then they were, Botswanan, or they were, their tribal identity or what have you. So yeah, there's certainly no essential anything culture. There have been attempts to use these problematic terms to try and build something, I think, progressive about like liberation about it. We're not like Black scholars or anything here. So, I would encourage you to read the enormous body of work produced by Black scholars on Blackness, on its relationship to whiteness, on the evolution of Blackness and whiteness in the sort of like quote unquote new world. There's lots of great literature on our reading list already about that. And I just, Walter Rodney would be my go-to source for that one. So Alex?
Yeah, just really quickly, because that was such a great answer. Again, I don't have much to add, but totally agree. No such thing as essential culture for anyone. But yeah, particularly for, minority groups or people who are seen as marginalized, there's often this expectation, I think, that they're more homogenous than they really are, right? In part because they're always seen from that dominant position of like the mainstream, right? But the fact is, these societies are incredibly diverse, right? And as you know from your own experience, you probably if you're connected with whoever your ancestors are, you probably disagree with some people in your community about like what the specifics of that cultural legacy are and how it ought to be practiced, especially if you live in the diaspora, like AJ's saying, right? And that's fruitful, and that's legit, and that happens, and that should happen, and people should be self-conscious. This great term by Mohawk scholar Taiyaki Alfred, this idea of self-conscious traditionalism, right? That like we're not about trying to recover some imagined lost past. We're riffing off the past, looking to recover as much as we can, bringing it into the present, and then thinking intentionally about this fundamental human work of culture making. If we are anything, it's like culture making machines, So I would just encourage you to think about it that way. I think I just did such a good job answering. I don't have anything else to say except to recommend another book that's already on the reading list. If you're interested in contemporary attempts to do some of this, especially in the Americas. So In the Shadow of Slavery, right, which is quite like, it's different than somebody in Africa trying to imagine this. Read Robin Kelly's work, Freedom Dreams. It's great. It's contemporary work. And he talks about many of these attempts to come up with a Pan-African identity, the struggles within the Black community for and against it. Just super interesting.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to sneak one last question in because it's quick and it's timely. It's something that's come up. I've been in the West Coast now for about 2-3 weeks, and it's actually come up probably 8 or 9 times. So I'm going to squeeze this one in, and then we'll say goodbye. But the question is just: does land back include private property? I feel like maybe this is a bit of an issue here in the West Coast, in particular, because there's so little land that's actually covered by any form of treaty. I think it's something like 97% of land in British Columbia is not covered by any kind of treaty or contemporary treaty. It's an important issue. It's something that we talk about in the book, something we've talked about previously in the show. And the gist of it is generally no. The principle of land back could extend to literally everything, because all of the land, all of it has been stolen and on unjust terms that never adequately understood and valued Indigenous law and Indigenous customs and Indigenous ontologies of land. So when people oftentimes want to say, oh, but some land was ceded, there was the treaty, there's this and that. I don't think that that's legitimate. That's my view. I don't think that that's legitimate because it favors settler colonial legal conventions from Europe, and it does not privilege Algonquin ways of thinking, or Squamish ways of thinking, or what have you. Until the conflicting ontological starting points, so the kind of knowledge, Indigenous knowledges, are put on equal footing, and you can have an actual discussion about what land is and then what it means to cede land, then there can be no fundamental legitimacy. All of that said, I have never met an Indigenous activist. I have not read about any Indigenous activists who have ever focused on taking anybody's private property, quote unquote, private property. And that's not because they don't have a legitimate right to, it's because they generally choose not to. And why do they choose not to? 80% of land in Canada is Crown land. And when you look at the history of what Crown land is, it's just land that was stolen and generally isn't even being used. This is a really big place. And what I have understood from land back has generally been that people are trying to reconnect with their land in meaningful ways. And that requires access to good, strong, healthy land. And then just draw your attention to the Canada Land podcast series has a special series within it called Land Back. And it's like a whole kind of mini series within Canada Land that is produced by Indigenous people about land back in a huge variety of different ways. So check out that resource. It's really helpful. Alex, I'm going to pass it to Alex, and then Alex will sign us off for this season, or sorry, this month.
Sounds good. Yeah, again, great answer. I would just say that again, I guess this is my theme of today. I think, you know, if you're anxious, if those terms and that call makes you anxious, I would again say, you know, what is the anxiety around that, right? For most of us, like for me, I'm a homeowner grudgingly. I pay mortgage to a bank, right? If I lose my job, then I basically have a month. If I miss 2 mortgage payments, the bank takes my house. So do I own the land? Does the bank own the land? I think the bank owns the land, and I pay rent to the bank basically for it. So like, my quibble is not with Indigenous peoples looking to restore their communities, their nations. What my quibble is with a world that won't let us live freely and justly together. And so I understand people's anxieties around, oh, what's going to happen to me, my home, my security. These are the things I want to leave to my children. But as Ajay said, you know, I have not come across a single Indigenous activist who has said, yes, settler, your house too. I have heard of people, settlers, who do choose to actually cede their land back to Indigenous nations upon their passing, or, you know, as a part of their inheritance, right? Like they actually give it back. That's cool, but they're choosing to do that, right? And as Ajay said, it's a big place. A lot of this territory is not inhabited. Us settlers like to live in this narrow strip, basically within an hour's drive of the US border. Think about all the territory that exists out there that Indigenous nations in particular have connection to, that you as a settler have no association with, have never seen, never like dipped a toe into, have no like ancestral connection to. I think like you have to stop being obsessed with the abstract notion of rights and territory, and understand what Ajay's been saying throughout this episode, whether we're talking about land acknowledgements or whether we're talking about land back, which is it's about your connection to the territory, to its history, to the people who inhabit it, to the non-human life that's there too. And so don't worry about places and spaces that you're not connected with. I can say with great certainty that no Indigenous movement today is looking to take your territory, but the goddamn bank might. Your boss might. And 1% definitely wants to impoverish you. Okay. So if we can like hone our collective aggravation, anxiety, fear of dispossession into the tip of a spear and point it at someone, let's point it at the people who are making our lives collectively more miserable, rather than the people who are trying to claw their way out of situations that have really that are not of their own making and are not specifically individually your fault either, unless you're a member of that 1%. But it's a much harder hill to climb than most of us have. So solidarity, folks. Thanks for being with us this month. Thanks to Ajay for working out time zone differences and being here all the way from the West Coast in the morning. I am in Mi'kmaq in the afternoon, very civilized over here. So we are looking forward to continuing this discussion with you. Of course, if you're going to be in London, England in a month's time, we are looking forward to seeing you. If not, we will see you at the next show, which will be the end of May.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
See you, everyone.
Thanks to our great host at Fernwood, of course. I think we neglected to shout him out at the beginning. Thanks so much. Fernwood Publishing, amazing, radical Canadian publisher. Check them out. Thanks, folks.
See ya. Probably hear Anne in the background. We still live.